Anthony adjusted the strap of his toolkit as he strode through the gleaming halls of the alien palace. The architecture was breathtaking, smooth curved walls that shimmered with iridescent colors, as if the very structure pulsed with life. He had been inside the royal compound before, but never this deep, never near the private chambers of the princess herself. That fact alone made him uneasy. Why would Princess Ashley herself request him personally for a repair job? The summons had been vague but urgent. A malfunction in the security system of her quarters had caused some kind of breach. Normally, palace engineers would handle something like this, but for some reason, Anthony had been chosen. He figured it had something to do with his reputation. He was one of the few humans trusted to work inside the palace, known for his expertise and discretion. Still, he hadn't expected to be sent to her private chambers. As he approached the massive doors, two guards in ceremonial armor blocked his path. Their tall, slender forms were unmistakably alien, their pale silver eyes scanning him with unreadable expressions. One of them, a female warrior with dark braided hair coiled around her horns, spoke first. "You are Anthony, the human engineer?" she asked, her tone formal yet laced with curiosity. "That's me," he said, lifting his identification badge. The other guard, a more imposing figure with deep blue markings on his forehead, studied him for a moment before nodding. "Her Highness is currently attending a diplomatic gathering. You are to complete your task quickly and touch nothing beyond what is necessary." Anthony nodded, accustomed to their strict protocols. "Understood." With a gesture, the guards activated the door controls. The massive entrance slid open silently, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. As soon as Anthony stepped inside, the doors sealed shut behind him. The princess's quarters were nothing like what he expected. Instead of the extravagant, jewel-studded decor he had imagined, the room had a serene, almost minimalistic beauty. Soft, flowing drapes billowed from the ceiling, illuminated by the gentle glow of suspended orbs that floated in the air like stars. The air was warm, scented faintly with something floral and exotic. His eyes swept the room, searching for the security panel he needed to fix. It should be near the far wall, next to... His thoughts scattered the moment he saw her. Ashley, standing at the center of the room, completely nude. Anthony froze, his breath caught in his throat. For a second, neither of them moved. Time itself seemed to stretch impossibly long, trapping them in that single, irreversible moment. Ashley's deep violet eyes widened in shock as she realized she was no longer alone. Her golden-hued skin shimmered under the soft lighting, accentuating the elegant lines of her body, the curve of her shoulders, the smoothness of her slender waist. Her long, silken hair cascaded down her back, partially shielding her, but not nearly enough. Anthony's brain screamed at him to look away, but his body refused to move. Ashley's lips parted in a sharp inhale, her regal composure shattering into pure, raw surprise. Then, in a blur of movement, she snatched a nearby sheer fabric, a decorative cloth draped over a chair, and wrapped it around herself in a frantic motion. The problem was, the fabric was more ornamental than functional, barely concealing what it needed to. "What are you doing here?" she finally burst out, her voice laced with both outrage and embarrassment. Anthony stammered, his mind scrambling for words. "I was sent to repair the security panel. I thought you were..." "I was in the cleansing chamber," she cut in, gripping the thin cloth against herself as if it could somehow erase what had just happened. Her expression flickered between mortification and disbelief. Anthony forced himself to turn his gaze toward the nearest wall, suddenly finding the intricate carvings on the pillars incredibly fascinating. I didn't mean to intrude, Your Highness. I swear, I thought you weren't here." There was a brief silence filled only with the sound of her hurried breathing. Then, Ashley exhaled sharply, composing herself. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said, her voice still tinged with residual embarrassment. "I was told the repair would be handled after I left for my meeting." Anthony swallowed hard. "I was just following orders. The guards let me in." Ashley muttered something under her breath in her native language, probably a curse. Then, taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin, forcing herself to regain some of her royal dignity, despite the situation. "Turn around," she ordered. Anthony didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, facing away from her completely, willing himself not to replay what he had just seen in his mind. He could hear her movements, the rustle of fabric as she dressed herself properly. A few moments later,
Was it curiosity? Doubt? She wasn't sure. She had always known that her duty would come before her own desires. As the heir to the Xerian throne, her life had never truly belonged to her. Every lesson, every moment of her existence had been carefully designed to mold her into the perfect ruler. But never had she imagined that her future would be bound to an alien. A human, no less. A soft hum of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see her mother, Queen Alara, descending the steps of her throne, her regal robes flowing behind her like liquid metal. "You are troubled," the queen observed, her golden eyes narrowing. Mary hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I only wonder if this is the right way." "The right way?" Alara repeated, tilting her head. "There is no other way." Mary shifted her gaze back to the image of James. "We are taking him from his home, forcing him into a life he never chose. How can we expect cooperation from someone who was given no choice?" Queen Alara studied her daughter for a long moment, then let out a soft sigh. "You are young, Mary. You still cling to the idea that every being in the universe has the luxury of choice." She stepped closer, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "But power, survival, these things are not dictated by choice. They are taken, seized. If we hesitate, if we allow sentiment to weaken us, we will vanish." Mary clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way. But she knew her mother too well. The queen was not one to be swayed by emotion. "This human, James Carter," Alara continued, gesturing toward the hologram, "he will resist at first. That is expected, but in time, he will understand. He will come to see the honor he has been given." Mary lowered her gaze, unwilling to meet her mother's eyes. "And if he doesn't?" Alara's expression darkened, and when she spoke, her voice was edged with cold finality. "Then he will have no other choice." The word sent a chill through Mary's veins. The queen turned, her flowing robes trailing behind her as she made her way toward the grand exit. But before she stepped through, she glanced over her shoulder. "Prepare yourself, daughter. Your destiny begins soon." And with that, she was gone. Mary stood there for a long while staring at the image of James Carter, a man who, at this very moment, had no idea that forces beyond his understanding were already moving against him. A man who was about to be ripped from his world and thrown into hers. She pressed her lips together, exhaling slowly. For better or worse, his fate was now intertwined with hers. The soft hum of city life surrounded James Carter as he walked through the dimly lit streets of New York. It was late, probably past midnight, but he didn't care. He liked the quiet of the city at this hour, when most of the world had gone to sleep, leaving only a few restless souls wandering under the glow of neon lights. He adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, shifting it higher onto his shoulder. The weight of his laptop inside was familiar, grounding. After a long day of work, all he wanted was to get home, crack open a beer, and fall asleep to the sound of a documentary playing in the background. James was an ordinary man, or at least he liked to think so. At 32, he had built a decent life for himself, nothing extravagant, but comfortable. He worked as a software developer, spending most of his time in front of a screen, solving problems that no one but his clients really understood. It was a quiet life, predictable, but all of that was about to change. As he turned onto a quieter street, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. A sudden awareness, like someone was watching him. He slowed his pace, glancing around. The street was nearly empty, save for a homeless man dozing in a doorway and a lone streetlight flickering in the distance. James shook his head. Get a grip, man. It's just another late night in the city. He continued walking, but the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The air felt charged like the calm before a thunderstorm. Then, without warning, everything changed. A blinding beam of blue-white light erupted from the sky, slamming into the pavement around him. The force sent a shockwave through the air, knocking over trash cans and sending loose papers flying. James staggered back, shielding his eyes. Panic surged through his chest. His first thought was that a helicopter's searchlight had hit him. But as his vision adjusted, he realized this was something else entirely. The light wasn't coming from above. It was surrounding him, encasing him in an otherworldly glow. His body lifted off the ground. James barely had time to gasp before an invisible force yanked him upward. His stomach lurched as the street below shrank away. The city lights blurred beneath him, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, darkness. A sharp,
She said after a moment, "You were the first." Something about the way she said it made Anthony wonder if she was telling the whole truth. But it wasn't his place to question her. Instead, he focused on fixing the issue. "It should be fine now. I'm reprogramming the system to restore the original security parameters." Ashley nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The idea that her private chambers had been left unguarded, even for a moment, was unsettling. Had it truly been a random malfunction, or was something else at play? Her gaze flickered back to Anthony. A human engineer had been sent to fix a breach in her security. It was an odd choice. Normally, palace engineers, trusted members of her own species, would handle such sensitive repairs. And yet, here he was. Ashley tapped her fingers against her arm. "Who gave you this assignment?" Anthony hesitated. "The royal advisors. I didn't question it." Ashley's expression darkened slightly, but she didn't press further. Instead, she watched as he finished the repair, his hands moving with precision and confidence. He was efficient, skilled, and despite their awkward first encounter, he didn't seem intimidated by her. Most men would be. When Anthony finally stood up, he let out a breath. "All done. Your system should be secure now." Ashley walked past him to test the panel. A soft chime confirmed that the biometric lock was reactivated. She pressed her palm against it, and the interface glowed in recognition. The doors responded instantly, sliding open and shut at her command. She turned back to Anthony, nodding in approval. "Impressive work," he smiled. "Thanks. I do my best." A pause stretched between them. The tension from earlier had mostly faded, replaced by something else, something neither of them acknowledged aloud. Ashley studied him for a moment longer before exhaling. "Very well. You've done your job. You may go." Anthony expected that. He grabbed his toolkit, gave a respectful nod, and headed toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, Ashley spoke again. "Anthony." He stopped, looking over his shoulder. Ashley's expression was unreadable. "If I ever need repairs again, I'll request you." There was something about the way she said it, something that made Anthony's pulse quicken. He gave a small smile. "I'll be ready." And with that, he stepped out, leaving Ashley standing alone in the chamber, her thoughts more tangled than she cared to admit. The moment the heavy doors slid shut behind Anthony, he let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart was still pounding. That had been, without a doubt, the most awkward and strangely intense situation he had ever been in. His logical mind told him to push it aside and move on. It had been an accident, nothing more. But another part of him, the part that still remembered the way Ashley had looked at him, the way her voice had softened just before he left, knew that something had changed between them. But dwelling on it wouldn't do him any favors. He was a palace engineer, a trusted worker, nothing more. Thinking otherwise would be foolish. As he started down the hallway, Anthony noticed that the guards who had been stationed outside Ashley's chambers were gone. That was odd. The royal family's security detail was never so careless. His instincts prickled with unease, but he shook it off. Maybe they had simply been reassigned. Still, something didn't sit right. He decided to head toward the main security hub to report the completed repair. As much as he wanted to pretend nothing unusual had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than a simple system malfunction. Inside Ashley's chambers, Ashley stood in the center of her room, staring at the newly repaired security panel. The system was working again. The doors were locked. Everything was back in order. So why did she still feel so unsettled? Her mind kept replaying the moment Anthony had walked in, the shock in his eyes, the way he had turned away so quickly, so respectfully. He had seen her in a state of complete vulnerability, yet he hadn't taken advantage of it. He hadn't lingered, hadn't stared in the way so many suitors had during royal gatherings when she wore her more revealing ceremonial gowns. Instead, he had been embarrassed, flustered even. And then just as quickly, he had composed himself, treating her with the same professionalism he would have given any other repair job. That reaction, it intrigued her. Ashley shook her head, trying to dispel the lingering thoughts. This is absurd. He's just a human engineer. And yet, the moment she had said his name, just before he left, something in his expression had shifted. It was subtle, but she had caught it. Curiosity, interest. She exhaled slowly. Whatever this was, it couldn't go anywhere. She had duties to uphold, responsibilities far beyond personal whims. A princess did not entertain feelings for a palace. Worker, it was unthinkable. But still, she had meant what she said. If she ever needed assistance again, she would request him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise outside her chambers, a sharp, metallic clink, followed by hushed voices. Her instincts flared. Ashley turned toward the door, her senses on high alert. Something was wrong. A sudden attack. Outside, Anthony had barely made it halfway down the corridor when the lights flickered, then abruptly cut out, plunging the hallway into darkness. Immediately, his gut told him something was very wrong. The palace never experienced power failures, especially not in the royal wing. Their technology was far too advanced for that. This was intentional. Then came the sound. Footsteps, fast and purposeful. Anthony pressed himself against the nearest wall, heart pounding. He could barely make out the shapes of several figures moving swiftly through the dimly lit corridor, heading toward Ashley's chambers. He didn't recognize their uniforms. They weren't palace guards, intruders. Before he could process his next move, the doors to Ashley's quarters hissed open. Anthony acted on pure instinct. He ran. As he approached, he saw Ashley standing just beyond the threshold, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she spotted the intruders. The figures moved quickly, too quickly. One of them raised a weapon, a sleek, curved blade that shimmered ominously in the low light. Anthony didn't think. He lunged. He slammed into the closest figure, knocking them off balance just as they moved toward Ashley. The force of impact sent both him and the intruder crashing to the ground. Pain shot up Anthony's side, but he ignored it, scrambling to his feet just as another attacker lunged at him. Ashley reacted instantly. With a swift, fluid motion, she seized a decorative staff from the nearby wall, a ceremonial piece but still solid enough to be used as a weapon. She swung it hard, striking one of the attackers across the face. The figure stumbled back with a grunt. Anthony barely dodged a blade aimed at his ribs. He twisted, grabbing the wrist of the attacker and forcing the weapon away. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew how to fight when necessary. Years of working in rough environments had given him enough survival instincts to hold his own. Ashley took a step back, pressing a hidden panel on the wall. A silent distress signal, one that would alert the palace guards. But would they arrive in time? Anthony ducked as another strike came his way, barely missing his head. He retaliated, landing a punch to his attacker's jaw. The figure staggered, but not for long. These weren't ordinary assassins. They were trained. Ashley caught movement from the corner of her eye. Another attacker was raising a weapon, this one aimed directly at Anthony's back. She didn't think. With a fierce cry, she moved swiftly, driving her makeshift staff into the attacker's side. The weapon discharged harmlessly as the figure crumpled to the floor. Anthony turned panting, eyes widening as he realized what had just happened. Ashley had just saved him. Their gazes locked for a split second, just long enough for unspoken understanding to pass between them. But they weren't safe yet. The last standing intruder let out a frustrated growl before activating a device on their wrist. A pulse of energy radiated outward, some kind of disruption signal. Ashley's body tensed as she recognized the technology. They're trying to disable the palace's security grid. Anthony didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the nearest fallen weapon, unfamiliar with its alien design, but not caring. If the guards didn't arrive soon, they'd have to defend themselves. The remaining attacker eyed them both, calculating. Then, in a blur of movement, they turned and sprinted down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows just as the lights flickered back to life. Seconds later, the sound of armored footsteps filled the air. The palace guards arrived. Too late. Ashley straightened, gripping her makeshift weapon tightly as she turned to face them. "Seal the exits. Find them." The guards immediately sprang into action. Anthony exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His adrenaline was still surging. He looked at Ashley, expecting her to be shaken. But instead, she was composed, angry. Her violet eyes met his, something intense burning within them. "This wasn't random," she said, voice low. "Someone wanted me vulnerable." Anthony nodded, his own pulse still racing. "And they didn't expect me to be here." Ashley took a slow breath. "Which means I might owe you my life." Silence stretched between them. Anthony swallowed. "So, do I get a raise?" Ashley blinked, then, despite everything, let out a small, unexpected laugh. It was the first moment of lightness in the chaos. And yet, as the reality of what had just happened settled over them, one thing became clear. Whatever was happening in the palace. This was only the beginning. Ashley stood in the center of her chambers, surrounded by guards who had arrived too late to stop the attack. The tension in the room was thick, a mixture of failure, unease, and something far more dangerous: doubt. The captain of the Royal Guard, a stern-faced man with deep scars along his temple, knelt before her. "Your Highness, we failed to anticipate this breach. There is no excuse." Ashley's eyes remained cold and sharp. "No, there isn't." The weight of her words pressed down on the soldiers around her. They were trained to protect her with their lives, and yet tonight, a handful of intruders had nearly reached her without resistance. If Anthony hadn't been there. Her gaze flickered to him, standing just a few feet away. His clothes were rumpled, his breathing still uneven from the fight. But he remained steady. He hadn't left. He could have run. The thought unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite define. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't bound by duty like the others, and yet when the danger came, he stayed. He fought. She turned back to the captain. "I want a full investigation. How did they enter? How did they reach my chambers? And why did my security system conveniently fail before their arrival?" The captain clenched his fist. "We will find out, Your Highness." "You'd better," she said, voice like steel, "because I will not tolerate a second failure." The guards bowed and dispersed, leaving only a handful stationed at the entrance. The moment the doors sealed shut again, the air shifted. The formalities were gone. Ashley exhaled, rolling the tension from her shoulders before turning to Anthony. "You should leave." Anthony, who had been watching silently, raised an eyebrow. "That's gratitude for you." Ashley sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "You know that's not what I mean." "I know," Anthony said, crossing his arms, "but I'm not going anywhere until I know you're actually safe." Ashley studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her violet eyes. He had no obligation to stay. And yet he did. She moved toward the window, looking out at the glowing city beyond the palace walls. "Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing," she murmured. They disabled my security, removed my guards, and waited until I was alone. This was deliberate. Anthony stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. And if they were willing to try once, they'll try again. Ashley nodded. Exactly. Silence stretched between them. For the first time since the attack, Ashley allowed herself to feel it, not just the anger, but the vulnerability beneath it. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but an unease she hadn't felt before. She was royalty. She had always been surrounded by protocol, by soldiers, by expectations. And yet tonight, standing in her own chambers, she had never felt less secure. Her hands tightened at her sides. I hate this feeling, she admitted, like I'm powerless. Anthony watched her, considering his next words carefully. You're not, he said simply. You fought back. You held your own. You weren't powerless. Ashley turned to face him, her expression unreadable. And yet, I would have been dead if you hadn't been here. Anthony let out a short breath. Then I guess it's a good thing I walked in on you earlier, huh? The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Ashley blinked, then let out a soft chuckle. A real one. The sound was warm, surprising even herself. Anthony grinned. You laughed. Mark this day in history. Ashley shook her head, amusement flickering in her eyes before fading into something more serious. I don't laugh often. I noticed. She studied him, as if seeing him in a new light. This human, this engineer, had done more than just fix her security system. He had protected her when it mattered, and now he stood here, speaking to her without fear or hesitation. She had grown accustomed to people treating her like something distant, something untouchable. But Anthony, he was different, and that difference was dangerous. Ashley turned away. You should get some rest. I doubt this will be the last time we see each other. Anthony hesitated, as if considering arguing, but then exhaled. Yeah, guess you're right. He moved toward the exit, but paused before the door. Ashley. Her name sounded strange coming from him. No formal titles, no stiffness. Just her name. She turned slightly, waiting. Anthony's expression softened. For what it's worth, I'm glad I was here. Something in her chest tightened, but she pushed it aside. Good night, Anthony. With one last glance, he left. Ashley stood alone in the quiet room, staring at the place where he had been. She didn't know what troubled her more, the attack on her life, or the fact that a human had just become the only person she truly trusted. Anthony had barely stepped out of Ashley's chambers when he felt the weight of everything. Crashed down on him. The adrenaline from the fight was wearing off, leaving behind a dull ache in his muscles and a sharp throbbing in his side where he'd taken a hit. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. What the hell did I just get myself into? The palace was supposed to be one of the most secure places in the kingdom, yet an assassination attempt had nearly succeeded, and if he hadn't been there, it would have. That fact gnawed at him, refusing to let go. A princess had almost been killed tonight. Ashley had almost been killed tonight, and he had been the only thing standing between her and death. He had no idea what to do with that realization. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the approaching footsteps until a voice snapped him back to reality. You! Anthony turned to find himself face to face with the captain of the Royal Guard. The man was tall and imposing, with piercing eyes that scrutinized him like a hawk sizing up prey. Anthony straightened. Captain. The captain's gaze flicked over him, taking in his disheveled appearance, the bruises already forming on his skin. You're the engineer who was in the princess's chambers when the attack happened. That's right. The captain's expression remained unreadable. Explain how you managed to hold your own against trained assassins. Anthony frowned. I didn't have a choice. They were going after Ashley. Princess Ashley. Not many palace workers would have thrown themselves into a fight they had no hope of winning. Anthony crossed his arms. Yeah, well, maybe I don't like standing around while people get killed. The captain studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. Anthony blinked. Good? The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. The princess is in danger, and I need every capable man on alert. Whether you like it or not, you just proved yourself. Anthony didn't like where this was going. Look, I just fix things. I'm not a soldier. Maybe not, the captain admitted, but you fought like one. He glanced toward Ashley's chambers. And the princess trusts you. Anthony hesitated. Did she? He wasn't sure, but she had looked at him differently before he left, as if seeing him in a new light. I don't know what's happening in this palace, the captain continued, but I do know this attack wasn't a random act of violence. Someone planned it. Someone inside these walls. Anthony's stomach tightened. You think it was an inside job? I don't think, the captain said grimly. I know. The words sent a chill down Anthony's spine. If the attack had been orchestrated by someone within the palace, that meant Ashley wasn't just in danger from outside forces. She was surrounded by enemies she couldn't even see. And that changed everything. The captain fixed him with a hard stare. I need someone who isn't tied to the Royal Guard. Someone who can move unnoticed. Someone the enemy won't suspect. Anthony let out a dry laugh. And you think that's me? You're the perfect candidate. Anthony shook his head. This is insane. I'm an engineer, not a spy. The captain's voice lowered. Would you rather walk away and pretend none of this happened? Pretend the princess wasn't nearly killed? That hit a nerve. Anthony clenched his jaw. He could walk away. He could go back to fixing security panels and pretending this wasn't his problem. But the truth was, the moment he had thrown himself into that fight, the moment he had stood between Ashley and those assassins, he had already made his choice. And deep down, he knew he wasn't going to walk away. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. The captain smirked. I'll take that as a yes. Anthony sighed, rubbing his temples. Fine. What do you need me to do? For now, just keep your eyes open, the captain said. Stay close to the princess. Watch who comes and goes. Listen for anything unusual. Anthony raised an eyebrow. You want me to spy on the royal court? I want you to protect the princess, the captain corrected, even if she doesn't realize she needs it. Anthony exhaled sharply. Great, just great. The captain placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Welcome to the real fight. Ashley sat on the edge of her bed, staring down at her hands. Her heart had finally stopped racing, but her thoughts were still tangled. Everything had changed tonight. She had spent her life surrounded by guards, by advisors, by people who treated her like something fragile, something that needed to be shielded. But when it mattered most, none of them had been there. Anthony had. Anthony. The thought of him lingered, unsettling in a way she couldn't quite explain. He was a human engineer, an outsider in the grand scheme of royal politics. And yet he had fought for her, not because he was ordered to, not because of duty or obligation, but because he chose to. That made him dangerous, not in the way the assassins were dangerous, but in a way that unsettled.
He didn't like the sound of that. She must have noticed his reaction because she shook her head. Not like that. I want to understand. James narrowed his eyes. Understand what? Mary exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. Your resistance, she said. Your anger, the way you fight against this. James frowned. You need me to explain why I don't want to be forced into breeding? Mary flinched at the word, but she didn't look away. On Xyrian, duty comes before desire. Our people do what is necessary for survival no matter the personal cost. The idea of refusing one's responsibility is difficult for me to understand. James scoffed. Yeah, well, humans aren't like that. We don't just blindly accept what we're told, we have free will. Mary looked down at her hands. And you believe I don't? James hesitated. Do you? A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Mary whispered, I don't know. James stared at her. For the first time, she looked lost, as if she was questioning everything she had been raised to believe. And in that moment, something shifted. James still didn't trust her, but he no longer saw her as just the enemy. She was just as trapped as he was. After a moment, Mary stood. You may hate me, James, she said softly, but I will not force you. That is not the way I want this to happen. James didn't know what to say. Before he could respond, she turned and left, the door sliding shut behind her. James let out a slow breath, his mind racing. Mary was different from her mother. That much was clear. And maybe, just maybe, he could use that to his advantage. James sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door long after Mary had left. His thoughts were a tangled mess. For days, his focus had been singular. Escape. Get off this ship. Get back to Earth. But now things weren't so simple. Mary wasn't just some alien princess following orders. She was trapped too. Maybe not in the same way, but still. She wasn't the enemy he had assumed. That didn't change the fact that he was still a prisoner. That didn't change the fact that the Queen wouldn't wait forever. James stood up and paced the length of the room. He needed a plan. The control panel had given him a sliver of hope, proof that there was a docking bay somewhere on this ship. If he could get there, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out. But he needed more than just knowledge. He needed an opportunity. And, if he was being honest with himself, he needed Mary. She had the authority to move freely. She might not help him directly, but she was his best chance at finding an opening. Could he convince her? James ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure, but he had to try. The next time Mary visited, she wasn't alone. Commander Varric entered first, his tall, imposing frame blocking the doorway for a moment before stepping aside to let Mary through. His silver armor gleamed under the room's soft lighting, and his expression was as hard as ever. James immediately tensed. He and Varric hadn't spoken much, but the hostility was always there, simmering beneath the surface. I assume I don't get a say in whatever's about to happen, James said, crossing his arms. Mary hesitated before responding. My mother wishes to see you. James narrowed his eyes. And if I say no? Varric let out a low growl. You will go, human. James's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He glanced at Mary, searching for some sign of what this was about. She wouldn't meet his gaze. That wasn't a good sign. Fine, James said, forcing his voice to stay even. Lead the way. The Queen's chambers were as intimidating as James remembered. The walls shimmered like molten silver, reflecting the dim light in strange, shifting patterns. A massive curved throne sat at the center of the room, and upon it, Queen Alara watched him with cold, calculating eyes. Mary stood slightly behind her, her posture stiff. James stopped in the middle of the chamber, refusing to bow or show any sign of submission. If Alara expected him to grovel, she was going to be disappointed. You summoned me, he said flatly. Alara smiled. Indeed. She studied him for a long moment, as if assessing something unseen. Then she stood, stepping gracefully down from her throne. Tell me, human, she said. Have you come to accept your role? James held her gaze. Not a chance. Alara's smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. Stubborn, she mused, but not unexpected. James clenched his fists. He hated the way she spoke, like he was some kind of experiment that amused her. I told you before, he said. I don't care what kind of crisis you're facing. I'm not going to be a part of it. Alara tilted her head. And yet, you still believe you have a choice. James stiffened. The Queen stepped closer, her golden eyes gleaming. You misunderstand, human. This is not about what you want. It is about what must be done.
Something deep within her, because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her not as a princess, but as a person worth protecting. And she wasn't sure what to do with that. A soft chime echoed through the room, pulling her from her thoughts. Her gaze flickered to the security panel. A message. She rose to her feet and approached cautiously. With a wave of her hand, the screen activated, revealing a single line of text. "You were supposed to die tonight." Ashley's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, her pulse pounding in her ears. Someone inside the palace had sent this. Someone who knew she had survived. Her grip tightened at her sides. If they wanted her dead, they would try again. And this time, she wouldn't be caught off guard. Ashley stood motionless, staring at the ominous message on the screen. "You were supposed to die tonight." The words sent a chill through her, not because she was afraid, but because they confirmed what she had suspected all along. This wasn't just an external attack. It wasn't a random attempt on her life. Someone within the palace walls wanted her dead. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. For a long moment, she just breathed, in and out, slow, controlled, letting the initial surge of shock fade so she could think clearly. Then she took action. With a quick movement, she disabled the message trace. If the sender had left any digital fingerprints, they would have already wiped them clean. Whoever they were careful, but not careful enough. Ashley activated her personal security feed, rewinding to the exact moment the message was delivered. The palace system might have been compromised earlier, but she had personally upgraded her chamber's security after the attack. If someone tried to send a message to her private terminal, there was a chance they had slipped up somewhere. She scanned the data, her violet eyes flickering across the screen. Then, there it was. A slight delay in the system's activity logs, barely noticeable, but just enough to indicate that something had been rerouted. Ashley smirked. "Got you." She quickly encrypted the file and sent it to a secure drive. She would analyze it later. For now, she needed to keep up appearances, act like nothing had happened. Whoever had sent this message expected her to be rattled. She refused to give them the satisfaction. With a deep breath, she straightened her posture and turned away from the screen. Her mind was already forming a plan. She needed information. She needed allies. And for better or worse, that meant she needed Anthony. Anthony lay on his back, staring at the ceiling of his temporary quarters. He should have been sleeping. His body wanted to sleep, but his mind refused. Everything about the night played over and over again in his head. The attack, the fight, Ashley's reaction, the conversation with the captain of the Royal Guard. And then there was her, Ashley. He didn't know what to make of her. She was nothing like he expected, not a spoiled royal, not a helpless damsel. She was sharp, calculating, and proud. Yet there had been a moment tonight when he had seen something else beneath the surface, something vulnerable. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because he wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to feel this growing pull toward her, but he did. A sharp knock on his door startled him. Anthony sat up immediately. "Who is it?" A pause, then, "It's me." "Ashley." Anthony quickly got up and opened the door. The moment he saw her standing there, dressed in a simple but elegant robe, her violet eyes steady, he knew something was wrong. He stepped aside, letting her in. "What happened?" Ashley didn't answer right away. She moved past him, scanning the room as if ensuring they were alone. Only after the door was closed did she turn to face him. "I got a message," she said, "from whoever planned the attack." Anthony's eyes darkened. "What did it say?" She met his gaze. "That I was supposed to die tonight." A rush of anger flared in Anthony's chest. "So they know you survived. And they're watching." "Exactly." He ran a hand through his hair. "Damn it." Ashley folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "I need your help." Anthony let out a short breath. "I figured as much." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't seem surprised." "That's because the captain of the guard already pulled me into this mess." Ashley blinked. "What?" Anthony sighed. "He basically recruited me to keep an eye on you. Said he doesn't trust anyone in the palace right now." For the first time, a flicker of something like relief crossed her face. "Then that makes things easier." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Easier how?" Ashley took a step closer. "Because I need someone I can trust. Someone who isn't tangled in royal politics. And like it or not, that's you. Anthony held her gaze. You trust me? Ashley hesitated. She hadn't met